Hello and welcome to this look at power authority in cities as contested spaces. On the image on your screen is of what's called a peace wall located in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Oftentimes contested spaces are illustrated by these physical barriers that separate different groups within a city. As we'll see, contested spaces include not only these physical barriers, but also social barriers. When we talk about power and authority, again, they're often demonstrated through a wall like this or spatial boundaries within our cities. But we'll also see how some of the actors, some of the mechanics, some of the social institutions are able to wield power and authority in a number of ways. So to start out, we'll look at different social institutions, primarily the state and market, and how these two work together and how they help deliver what we previously recognized as growth machines. We'll also look at marginalized groups, because if we're talking about contested spaces, then we need to look at two sides of an issue, both the social institutions that have the power and the group that's marginalized. We'll look at a number of examples that highlight local, national, and international contested spaces. And I want you to think ahead and understand how these contested spaces also reflect Clay's turf, which we'll cover in an upcoming lecture. So when we talk about our social institutions, the first institution that we need to highlight is the state. And the state is where our power is concentrated. When we talk about state, we talk about a number of different topics, including law, the legislator, the police force. So the application of law by a police force, the writing and theory creation behind the law by our legislator. So our states wield a tremendous amount of power. These institutions exist at all levels of government, from local to national to international. When we talk about states, we look at the difference between an authoritarian and a democratic state. An authoritarian state requires a high level of compliance, and decisions are made at the upper echelons of government. In a democratic state, we see the requirement of a citizen involvement, and a higher level of choice is found in our democratic states. The examples that we're going to look at today would fall under a democratic state, but we'll see even our marginalized groups within our democratic states oftentimes lack that ability to influence decisions, lack that choice that is supposed to be found in democratic states. Our second social institution is known as the market, and the market is home to our business and financial institutions. So the free market is a market that is not hindered by government regulation, that allows capitalism, exchange to go on unimpeded. What we see is that markets are regulated by our states. In an authoritarian state, the market is tightly controlled. So in a communist country like China, the market is very tightly controlled by the government, where some areas, those special economic zones that permit trade, are open to outside interaction, but for the most part, the authoritarian regime controls every aspect of the market. In a democratic state, the market is generally allowed more leeway, and the idea of a total free market is really non-existent in the world today, but we see that our democratic states generally have less regulations on our markets. In the period between the 1930s and the 1970s, we saw that our states had a lot more regulations in place. When we look at North America, when we look at Western Europe, when we look at our long-standing democratic countries, we found, again, in the mid-20th century, the 1930s to the 1970s, that the state was interested in improving the lives of citizens, redistributing wealth, providing social welfare. Beginning in the 1970s, we saw what's known as a neoliberal shift. Neoliberal meaning free market, liberal in this case meaning free, less government intervention. And we also saw a shift towards privatization, where a lot of the social benefits that were found between 1930 and 1970 that were owned and that were operated by local governments were handed over to private firms. Something as simple as trash collection was privatized. Different services that our cities offer were privatized as we shifted away again from social welfare to neoliberalism. One of the big concerns with this shift is the widening wealth gap that we're experiencing not only in North America but around the world. So while there has been a tremendous amount of economic benefit overall in this shift, we see how those in different levels of our socioeconomic classes are becoming further and further apart. So the states, again, regulate markets. And if a state is taking more of a neoliberal approach, we're going to see more privatization. We're going to see the pursuit of profit in our markets. We're going to see how our states could help these markets grow. Where on the other hand, social welfare, we're reeling in, we're taxing more, we're spending that tax revenue on local services, but at the expense of limiting profits. Another group is made really in a combination between states and markets. You'll recall from earlier this semester when we talked about growth machines, those individuals from public and private groups that look to expand interest in our cities, in our metropolitan areas. So our public-private partnerships are often made up of elected officials and local business groups, oftentimes developers that are looking for a way to work with the local government, work with the state to facilitate growth and development. We're going to see how different state regulations support or facilitate investment. And this could be done through reducing or removing property taxes. This could be created through raising money through bonds to help pay for development. So when we look at the power of our interest group as a social institution, we really see how our states and markets work closely together. And what we're seeing in our Western democratic states is more of a shift towards market dominance. In Baltimore City, they've raised hundreds of millions of dollars to support the Under Armour campus in South Baltimore. You'll recognize around the country, if you're a sports fan, that tax dollars are often used to support the planning and development of a stadium. So a stadium that'll bring thousands of people into the city with the idea that it'll help facilitate consumer spending in the city. But we see again a shift from healthcare, education, infrastructure towards facilitating the markets. And with that, there are certainly benefits, but there are also concerns. The images on your screen reflect two marginalized groups that can be found close to Towson University. These marginalized groups generally have fewer rights, are less recognized, and experience fewer of the benefits that we see grow out of the relationship between markets and states. On the bottom left, you see an image of a squeegee boy, and the squeegee kids in Baltimore City over the last decade have become a point of contention. You'll find these kids at stoplights at some of the major interchanges in Baltimore City. So if you drive south on Interstate 83 into Baltimore City, there's a good chance on a nice day that a couple kids will come up and spray window cleaner on your car and try to squeegee it. Groups like this are often seen as a nuisance within the city. And over the last few years, there have been more and more squeegee kids. There have been more and more reports of conflict between commuters and squeegee kids, where squeegee kids and commuters are both getting aggressive with one another. When we think about contestation of space, we think about those immediate intersections and how the squeegee kids are claiming that for a hustle or for a chance to make money, and the commuter is simply trying to move along his or her way to get through the city. Baltimore City, has been back and forth on how to manage the squeegee kids. They're trying to provide different opportunities away from the intersections for the kids to make money. But again, we see a marginalized group. We see a group of kids that come from primarily low income or poverty situations that are trying to make money in the city. And when we look at a marginalized group, we see that this group doesn't have much recognition. It doesn't have much of a legal standing or a voice. So they're an easy group to consider a nuisance and move along to clear out of an area. On the bottom right, you see a church at the base of 83, where 83 and Fayette Street hit in Baltimore City, St. Vincent de Paulo, and this is a place where homeless people congregate. And again, you could see the contestation of space occurring here, where homeless people who are often moved throughout the city need somewhere to go. They need somewhere to congregate. They need somewhere to sleep. So it's not uncommon in cities to find areas where homeless groups take over. And you'll find throughout the city symbols of this contestation. If you ever sit at a bench in a city and you notice that in the middle of the bench there's an armrest, well, that armrest serves two purposes. One is to provide some comfort when you sit short term. Another reason for that armrest is to prevent people from sleeping on that bench, prevent people from lying down. So we see the contestation. We see this ongoing fight. Oftentimes, we need to hone in to recognize really what are the groups in play here with our squeegee boys and with our homeless population. We see the contestation between our state and markets and our marginalized group, where the state is the one that enforces the laws, that has the authority, that could say that you are panhandling, you are illegally standing in the middle of a major roadway, you're trespassing. And trespassing can be applied to our homeless population. So the state has the authority and the legal mechanics to remove these groups. And the market also sees them as a nuisance because when you drive into Baltimore City, where the squeegee boys and the homeless population are established on a regular basis, you see people that are going to work. You see people that are going to spend money at local stores and restaurants. And this becomes a hindrance. This becomes a distraction to people that are entering the city. So it's seen as a nuisance for the market. And again, the state and the market have gone back and forth between exerting control in removing these marginalized groups and also trying to figure out a way to support them. But the groups themselves have fewer rights, limited voice or recognition in these interactions. So when we look at our marginalized groups, and we'll look at more in our upcoming examples, we see the difference between the insiders and the outsiders. We see the insiders as those that wield or control power, and we see the outsiders as those that are contesting the space. So we'll look at some different examples of this dynamic, this insider-outsider dynamic, and we'll see in several cases how spatial boundaries come into play, where our group in authority or a marginalized group are designated or found in different parts of our cities and our urban areas.